In the College Board Stimulus, The Meditations of Emperor Marcus Antonius Aurelius, he writes that there can be no good for things which subsist in change, and there can be no good for things which subsist without it. Modernity compounds existing interests, most fail to accomplish, and Greece, a member of the supposedly world-leading European Union, is just one example. According to the Human Rights Watch, Greek security forces have detained, assaulted, sexually assaulted, robbed, and stripped asylum seekers, forcing them back into Turkey. And top EU officials have complimented this behavior from Greece, citing it as purely a defensive mechanism. Populations will discriminate, both economically and politically, immigrants entering their nations, even when there is proof that these immigrants have a net positive effect for their economies. This begs the question of exactly why they're doing this. Good afternoon, my name is Felipe Salamanca, and today I'll be talking about EU immigration and right-wing populism and how it affects the opportunities of immigrants entering the EU. We first have to ask the question of exactly why they're doing this. So, to what extent has right-wing populist theory shaped the impact of migration policies on Asian and African immigrants' economic opportunities within the European Union since its inception in 1993? Through thorough review of both the mechanisms, economically and politically, that European governments use to discriminate against immigrants, I've come to the conclusion.
Go back and forth again. Go ahead, one more slide. It's something with your slide.
I mean, the slide is just an image with the text on it.
Just go, keep going, don't worry about it.
Okay.
You don't lose points for technical issues, so.
This leads me to the argument that through thorough examination of European mechanisms, I've come to the conclusion that the EU governments have systematically stripped economic opportunities through exclusionary border policies and economic policies. But first, we have to discuss exactly how populism works and how it affects these policies. Former Canadian politician and current academic Michael Ignatieff writes that new metaphors have entered the democratic body politic, categorizing the refugee not as an individual with rights and a moral claim, but as the invasive other. What this essentially means is that people within these European governments will otherize immigrants, treat them as subhuman almost, compared to these to people who are of the nation of origin, the nation that is receiving these immigrants. And these people will elect politician after politician after politician that matches these ideals that the population gains. This leads to a net negative for immigrants trying to enter these different countries, such as in Italy. Back in 2022, the Italian government rejected thousands of immigrants incoming from Libya because they cited it as a smuggling precaution. This smuggling precaution turned out to be untrue when the evidence came up later, but it does not change the fact that these immigrants were actually turned away for apparently no reason. And exactly how this populist theory spreads can best be explained through the media. The Chinese government, starting sometime in the mid-2010s, began setting up re-education camps to detain Uyghurs and re-educate them to better fit the culture of the Han Chinese, the majority ethnic group within China. However, despite this ongoing supposed genocide, according to the diplomat, a large portion of Chinese people still believe that Uyghurs are living their happy lives in Western China, enjoying all the privileges the Chinese government has given them. When the only media available is what the government will tell you, it's difficult to believe otherwise. Essentially, this applies to the European Union as well. As well, the EU specifically is against state-run media. They have no actual safeguards to protect against the use of state-run media. And essentially what this means for governments within the EU is that since there's no safeguard against it, whatever political parties in power can put whatever they want within the media, because according to media landscapes, there's actually proof that multiple European governments have been funding the largest media organizations within those countries, likely meaning that they have influence over the words these media organizations state, meaning they in turn have power over what is told to the people, not just through the government lens, but also through supposedly independent media organizations. This leads us to how this affects immigrants both economically and politically. Starting with economically. Because of this large anti-immigrant sentiment that occurs as a result of all these different factors, we see that even when taking into consideration having immigrants and domestic workers be in the same exact field of work, there is still a large wage gap. And please note that the more populous the government is considered, the larger the wage gap is between domestic and foreign workers within the same work field. But beyond economically, they're also affected politically. What ends up happening is, as I mentioned with the early example of Italy, you have these European governments actively trying to prevent immigrants from entering their countries. And when they cannot do it through systems like their Coast Guard, they have to make political statements like we saw again earlier with the 2022 Italy example, deflecting the issue to something that is completely different from what is actually true. So in the case of the smuggling excuse, again, there is no proof that there are actually smugglers on board, and this is purely an excuse to get immigrants turned away from their border. With all that being said, we need to consider what are possible solutions to the impacts of right-wing populism within these European governments, starting with a reinvigoration of the international courts. The international courts have long been simply stepped over by governments who do not care for human rights, simply because they have no proper enforcement, which is a sort of limitation. But when we have democratic processes working internationally, we can get these governments together to hopefully come to a consensus of what is good and what is bad, and hopefully reinvigorate the courts to actually have action taken against countries that have inherently violated human rights over the course of decades. A second solution is trade embargoes being placed on refugee laws. Now, it's important to consider that this cannot be done by a single sole country. The US, for example, has attempted trade embargoes in the past in countries like China, but this had more destruction on the American economy than anything else, which brings the need for, again, countries to work together to have trade embargoes placed upon countries that are in violation of human rights, similar to what we have been seeing during the Russia-Ukraine war, with embargoes being placed on Russia by multiple countries, not solely the US. However, again, the strength and importance to certain economies, such as the Chinese economy, but certainly some European economies as well, means that it's difficult to do this solely, which again brings back the reason to have multiple countries work together and not have singular hero countries trying to combat these human rights abuses. And that leads me to my last solution, which is the separation of state and media, because as I've already cited earlier, when state-run media is the only passage through which the people of a certain country can gain their information, they're essentially extremely limited and no longer have any ability to gain any unbiased information. By separating the state and media, so by making the media privately owned and entirely separate from the government, you have unbiased sources of media from which the people can be informed, which means less anti-immigrant sentiment overall for people living within these EU countries. Because, like I said earlier, when there's a certain political party in power, such as with countries like Italy, Germany, Spain, Greece, countries that line the Mediterranean Sea and which receive the brunt of these immigrants, when they have populist parties in power that are able to choose who gets to live in, choose what gets to be said in the media, what happens is that this anti-immigrant sentiment becomes norm. And the last limitation is a lack of enforcement overall. Because again, this ties back to the issue of countries that aren't necessarily having any incentive to work together. Thank you, and this is my worst session.
2 questions for you. Stay back up a little bit so you're still on the phone. Thank you. What information did you need that you weren't able to locate?
There was certain information regarding the segregation, not class, but the ethnic segregation of people living within these European countries. But there are 2 reasons why I didn't include this. One, again, the information is difficult to come across. Because again, most of the information regarding the segregation of people who live in communities is on a class basis, but also because it was kind of difficult to link to the entire argument surrounding the government persecution of these people, because it's often at the border and not within the border. Within the border, it's often the economic segregation and not necessarily anything regarding to where they live in a community.
What advice would you have for other researchers that consider this topic in the future?
if people wish to go through this topic, I think it's important to recognize exactly how they got to this situation to begin with. So why are these immigrants, why are there so many refugees coming from countries in Asia and in Africa, and how can we prevent these populist governments from even having to make these decisions? How can we stop people from leaving these countries because of the terrible conditions they are currently in? I think there is certainly a prerequisite to actually having any of these issues be addressed.